Montana Territory, November 1887. The most respected builder in Bitterroot Valley stood in front of Ezra Dalton's half-finished cabin and said 3 words that echoed through the settlement. "This is madness." What Ezra was building looked wrong. It looked dangerous. It looked like the work of a man who'd lost his mind to the mountain cold. But by February, when temperatures plunged to 30 below and families huddled around failing fires, that same builder would stand at Ezra's door, asking questions. Today you're going to understand why the worst idea in frontier construction became the most copied design in the territory. And if you want to receive a real survival technique every week, methods that worked when life actually depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. We're building a community of people who know that old doesn't mean obsolete. Now, let me show you what Ezra Dalton understood about heat that everyone else missed. Ezra Dalton wasn't a revolutionary. He was a sawmill operator with a wife, 2 daughters under 6, and a problem that was slowly killing his family. His cabin followed every standard rule of Montana Territory construction. 16-foot square, double-stacked logs with moss chinking, corner fireplace built by the valley's best mason, thick pine door, oiled canvas over the windows. By every measure, it should have been warm. It wasn't. The first winter, 1885 to 86, Ezra burned through 4 cords of lodgepole pine before January ended. The fire roared. The hearthstones glowed. And still, his daughters woke with frost in their hair. The floor stayed cold enough to freeze water in a cup. The far corners of the cabin hovered barely above freezing, even when the firebox blazed white-hot. Ezra's wife, Clara, started coughing in December. By February, both girls were sick. The family spent 16 hours a day within 3 feet of the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and still shivered. This wasn't unique to the Daltons. Every cabin in the valley fought the same war. Families rose at 4 a.m. to restart dead fires. Children slept in coats. Elderly settlers developed frostbite inside their own homes. Wood consumption was staggering, 8 to 10 cords per winter for a family of 4. And still, people froze. The accepted wisdom was simple. Montana winter is brutal, and you survive by feeding the fire. Burn more, stack more, cut more. The cold always wins a little. But Ezra couldn't accept that. Not when his youngest daughter, Annie, started showing signs of pneumonia. Not when he calculated that his family was burning $60 in firewood value per season, nearly a quarter of his annual income, and still living in misery. So in the spring of 1887, while other men were planting and fencing, Ezra was sketching plans in sawdust on his mill floor. The standard cabin design was the problem. It heated a large volume of air that constantly leaked through gaps, floor, and roof. The walls, even double-stacked logs, couldn't hold heat against the relentless wind. The floor sat directly on frozen earth that sucked warmth downward. Every surface radiated precious heat into the void. Ezra's solution seemed insane. Build a second structure inside the first. A smaller, stone-lined chamber that would create a warm core within the failing shell of his existing cabin. Not an addition, not a lean-to, a bunker inside the cabin itself. When he mentioned it to his neighbor, the man laughed and said, "You're going to cook yourself in your own coffin." Ezra started building anyway. What Ezra constructed over the summer of 1887 defied every principle of accepted frontier architecture. He started by digging. Inside his existing cabin, he excavated 18 inches down across a 12 by 12-foot area in the center of the floor. He lined this shallow pit with flat river stones, creating a thermal foundation that reached below the frost line. The earth itself would become the first layer of insulation. Then came the walls. But not cabin walls, bunker walls. Ezra built an inner structure using the straightest, tightest-fitted logs he'd ever cut. 8-inch diameter lodgepole, debarked, seasoned for 2 years. These inner walls rose 7 feet high, creating a compact rectangular room within the larger cabin. The gap between the original cabin walls and this new inner chamber measured 24 inches on all sides. Into that gap, Ezra packed everything the valley had mocked him for collecting: river stone, clay from the creek bed, dried moss, pine bark, and sand. Layer after layer. The result was a 2-foot-thick insulation barrier that surrounded the inner room on all 4 sides. The ceiling was equally radical. Ezra built a low, flat roof over the inner chamber using split logs covered with 6 inches of clay and stone. Above this thermal ceiling, the original cabin roof remained, creating an air gap, a buffer zone where cold air could settle without touching the living space. For heat, he positioned a small masonry stove in the corner of the inner room. Not a massive fireplace, a compact, carefully designed firebox built from soapstone and backed by 18 inches of stacked river rock. The chimney ran up through the insulated ceiling, through the air gap, and out the original roof. The stone backing would absorb and radiate heat for hours after the fire died. The inner room measured only 12 by 12 by 7 feet, 108 square feet of living space, 60 cubic feet of air to heat. His original cabin had been 256 square feet. By reducing the heated volume by more than half and wrapping it in thermal mass, Ezra was creating a heat retention system, not just a heated room. Ventilation came through 2 small adjustable ports, one low near the floor, one high near the ceiling, that could be opened or closed to control fresh air without bleeding heat. The door into the inner chamber was small, thick, and doubled, 2 layers with an air gap between. To anyone watching, it looked like Ezra was building a stone oven and planning to live inside it. The criticisms came fast and specific. Marcus Trent, the territory's most experienced builder and the man who'd built half the cabins in Bitterroot Valley, visited in August. He walked around the construction, touched the stone, measured the walls with his hands, and delivered his verdict loud enough for 3 neighboring families to hear. "This is a death trap, Dalton. You're sealing yourself in with a fire. One bad draft, one crack in that chimney, and your family suffocates in their sleep. And if the smoke doesn't kill you, the moisture will. You're packing organic material into those walls, moss, bar clay. It'll hold water. It'll rot. In 2 winters, this whole thing collapses inward, or worse, catches fire from the inside where you can't see it." Another voice, Samuel Pruitt, a stone mason with 20 years of Montana experience. "You can't heat stone that thick. It'll suck the warmth right out of your fire and give nothing back. You'll burn twice the wood just trying to warm the walls. And that ceiling? Low, heavy, packed with clay? That's not a home. That's a tomb." The social judgment stung worse than the technical criticism. Women from a valley told Clara she was risking her children for her husband's pride. One said, "A real man faces winter with fire and grit, not by hiding in a hole." Another called the inner chamber a coward's cave. Even Ezra's own brother refused to help with the final construction, saying, "I won't be part of killing your family." But Ezra had done the calculations. He'd tested the clay's water resistance. He'd designed the chimney draft with a mathematician's precision. He'd left inspection gaps in the stone packing to monitor moisture. He'd studied the Scandinavian turf homes his grandfather had described, the earth lodges of the Mandan people, the pit houses that had kept humans alive for thousands of years. This wasn't madness. It was engineering. By October, the inner chamber was complete. Ezra moved his family inside. The door to the outer cabin stayed open during the day for light and access. At night, they sealed themselves into the 12 by 12 stone-wrapped room and lit a fire the size of a dinner plate. The first snow came on November 7th. By November 12th, the real cold arrived. The mockery reached its peak the day Marcus Trent brought witnesses. It was mid-November, and Ezra had been living in the inner chamber for 2 weeks. The temperature outside had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and the valley was preparing for what old-timers were calling an early hard winter. Trent arrived with 4 men, 2 builders, the valley supply manager, and a retired Army engineer named Captain Howell who'd overseen fort construction across 3 territories. They'd come, Trent announced, to document a preventable disaster before it happens. Captain Howell examined the structure with clinical precision. He measured the wall thickness. He calculated the interior volume. He inspected the chimney draft. Then he stood in the outer cabin, the cold, abandoned shell surrounding Ezra's warm bunker, and delivered his assessment. "Mr. Dalton, I've seen men die in structures better designed than this. Your ventilation is insufficient for continuous occupation. Your moisture barrier is non-existent. You've created a condensation trap that will saturate those insulating materials within weeks. And this stone mass you're so proud of? It's a heat sink. You'll pour fire into this room and watch it disappear into 2 tons of frozen rock. If the smoke doesn't kill you, the hypothermia will. One of the builders added his voice. You've turned a marginal cabin into a guaranteed failure. That chimney will backdraft. I've seen it happen in smaller spaces than this. 1 wind shift, 1 pressure change, and smoke fills this room with nowhere to go. Your family will die in their sleep. The supply manager had economic concerns. Dalton, you've sunk 3 months of labor and $40 in materials into this experiment. You could have built a proper addition, doubled your cabin size, installed a standard hearth. Instead, you made a smaller, darker, more dangerous version of what you already had. When this fails, and it will, you'll have to rebuild from scratch. You'll be broke and homeless by spring. But it was the social condemnation that cut deepest. Marcus Trent turned to the gathered crowd. A dozen settlers had come to watch the spectacle, and said, "This isn't innovation. This is fear. A real frontiersman doesn't shrink from winter. He builds bigger fires, cuts more wood, and provides for his family through strength and perseverance." Hiding in a stone box? That's not survival. That's surrender. One woman in the crowd, a widow who'd survived 4 Montana winters alone, called out, "Clara Dalton, you've got daughters to protect. Don't let pride kill them. You can stay in my cabin until your husband comes to his senses." Ezra stood in the doorway of his inner chamber and said nothing. His jaw was tight. His hands were steady. He'd heard the same criticisms for months. He'd calculated the risks. He'd built in safety margins. He'd tested every joint, every seal, every airflow. But numbers don't argue with crowds. Captain Howell made one final statement before leaving. "I'm filing a report with the Territorial Safety Office. If anyone dies in this structure, the responsibility is documented. Mr. Dalton, I hope you reconsider before the real cold arrives." The real cold was 3 weeks away. By December 5th, the temperature would hit 32 below zero. The wind would rise to 40 miles per hour, and the valley would learn the difference between conventional wisdom and thermal physics. But first, Ezra had to endure 3 more weeks of neighbors walking past his cabin, shaking their heads, and taking bets on when he'd abandon the bunker and return to normal living. Children started calling his home the Stone Grave. Adults whispered that Clara should take the girls and leave before tragedy struck. Ezra kept the fire small, monitored the moisture levels, adjusted the ventilation, and waited for winter to deliver its verdict. The blizzard that would become known as the Bitterroot Siege began on December 4th, 1887, with a temperature drop so sudden that cattle froze standing in fields. By noon, the thermometer outside Ezra's cabin read 18 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, it was 0. By midnight, 12 below. And then the wind came. For the next 23 days, the Bitterroot Valley endured conditions that old journals would later describe as unfit for human habitation. Temperatures ranged from 15 below to 35 below zero. Wind speeds sustained at 25 to 40 miles per hour, with gusts strong enough to rip shingles from roofs and knock over stacked firewood. The snow came in horizontal sheets, finding every crack, every gap, every weakness in every structure. Cabins that had stood for 5 years began to fail. Chinking blew out. Canvas windows tore. Doors froze shut from the inside as moisture condensed and turned to ice. And wood, the valley's lifeline, became a desperate, losing battle. Families burned through their stockpiles at terrifying rates. A cord of wood that should have lasted 2 weeks was gone in 5 days. Men ventured into 40 below wind to split frozen logs, risking frostbite with every swing of the axe. Women fed fires every 2 hours, day and night, and still woke to ice forming on the inside walls of their cabins. By December 10th, Marcus Trent's family was burning furniture. By December 15th, the widow who'd offered Clara shelter was rationing her firewood to 1 fire per day, kept alive only during waking hours. At night, she and her children huddled under every blanket they owned and endured. Samuel Pruitt, the mason, developed frostbite on 3 fingers from nighttime trips to his woodpile. Captain Howell's Fort Standard cabin maintained a barely livable 45 degrees inside, despite a fire that consumed 6 full logs every 4 hours. Children stopped playing. Elderly settlers stopped leaving their beds. The valley physician treated 14 cases of frostbite, 7 cases of pneumonia, and 2 near deaths from hypothermia, all people who never left their homes. And in the center of this frozen hell, in a cabin everyone had called a death trap, Ezra Dalton's family was warm. The difference wasn't subtle. It was obvious. Ezra's chimney produced a thin, steady stream of smoke, nothing like the billowing columns pouring from his neighbors' fires. His trips to the woodpile happened once in the morning, once in the evening. No midnight scrambles. No frozen-fingered log splitting in the dark. On December 18th, when the temperature hit 32 below and the wind screamed at 40 miles per hour, Marcus Trent walked past Ezra's cabin and saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Clara Dalton, visible through the small window of the inner chamber, was sewing by lamplight. Not huddled by the fire, not wrapped in blankets, just sewing. Her children were playing on the floor, not near the stove, on the floor, in the far corner of the room. Trent stood in the -30 wind, shivering despite his heavy coat and fur hat, and stared at a scene that shouldn't exist. A family living comfortably while the world outside tried to kill everything warm-blooded. He wasn't the only one who noticed. On December 21st, the valley's supply manager trudged through waist-deep snow to check on families. He found the Daltons eating dinner at a small table, the room warm enough that Ezra had removed his jacket. The fire in the soapstone stove was small, smaller than a campfire. The supply manager, nearly hypothermic from his rounds, asked the question everyone was thinking. How much wood are you burning? Ezra's answer was quiet, factual, and devastating. Half a cord since the cold started. About 18 days now. Half a cord. His neighbors were burning that much in 3 days. Stay with me, because what happened next silenced every critic and changed frontier construction across 3 territories. The numbers were about to make denial impossible. On December 23, 1887, Captain Howell returned to Ezra Dalton's cabin with a thermometer, a notebook, and the closest thing to humility a military engineer could muster. He hadn't come to apologize. He'd come to measure, because the impossible was happening, and men of science need numbers to explain the impossible. What Howell documented over the next 4 hours would be reprinted in territorial newspapers, cited in construction journals, and referenced in homesteading guides for the next 30 years. The exterior temperature that morning was 28 degrees below zero. Wind speed, 32 miles per hour. Effective temperature with wind chill, approximately 55 below. Inside Marcus Trent's cabin, the valley's standard for proper construction, Howell recorded an interior temperature of 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Trent's fireplace was consuming 1 full log every 45 minutes. The fire had been burning continuously for 16 days. The family huddled within 6 feet of the hearth, wrapped in blankets. The far corners of the cabin measured 34 degrees. The floor, even near the fire, was too cold to stand on in stocking feet. Inside Samuel Pruitt's home, built with the mason's own expert stonework, 43 degrees. His family wore coats indoors. Ice formed on the interior walls every night. Wood consumption, 5 to 6 logs per 3 hours. Inside Captain Howell's own quarters, 49 degrees, maintained by a fire that required feeding every 90 minutes, day and night. Then Howell entered Ezra Dalton's inner chamber. The thermometer read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Howell checked his instrument, shook it, waited 5 minutes, and measured again. 68 degrees. The soapstone stove held a fire the size of a man's hat. Ezra had fed it 3 small logs 2 hours earlier. The next feeding wouldn't happen for another 90 minutes. The family wore normal indoor clothing. No coats, no blankets. Clara was preparing bread dough. The children were playing with wooden toys on the floor. The floor, in the corner farthest from the stove. Howell placed his thermometer on that floor. 63 degrees. In Trent's cabin, the floor registered 34 degrees 6 feet from a roaring fire. The numbers got worse or better depending on perspective. Howell conducted what he called a thermal extinction test. He asked Ezra to let the fire die completely and monitor the temperature decline. In the inner chamber, with no active fire, the temperature dropped from 68 degrees to 61 degrees over 8 hours. It stabilized at 58 degrees and held there through the night. Howell performed the same test in his own cabin. With no fire, his interior temperature dropped from 49 degrees to 37 degrees in 2 hours. By morning, it was 26 degrees below freezing. The heat retention difference was staggering. Ezra's stone-wrapped bunker held livable warmth for more than 12 hours after the fire died. Standard cabins became uninhabitable in under 3 hours. Wood consumption told an even more dramatic story. From December 4th to December 27th, 23 days of brutal cold, Ezra Dalton burned through exactly 2/3 of 1 cord of firewood. His neighbors, in equivalent-sized structures, consumed between 3 and 4 cords in the same period. The math was simple and devastating. Ezra was using 40% of the wood his neighbors required, while maintaining interior temperatures 20 to 25 degrees warmer. Captain Howell's final measurement shocked even him. Thermal efficiency per log. In a standard cabin, 1 log produced approximately 45 minutes of marginal warmth before requiring replacement. In Ezra's chamber, 1 log contributed to sustained heat for nearly 4 hours, thanks to the thermal mass storage and reduced heat loss. Howell wrote in his notebook, "The stone mass acts as a thermal battery. It absorbs heat during combustion and releases it slowly over extended periods. The insulation barrier prevents convective and conductive loss. The reduced interior volume requires less energy to heat. The result is not magic, it's physics. But the most powerful number was the simplest: 0. 0 cases of frostbite in the Dalton family. 0 nights of illness. 0 hours spent huddling in coats beside an inadequate fire. 0 frozen water inside the living space. 0 panic over dwindling wood supplies. While the valley suffered, the Daltons lived. On December 28th, the temperature rose to 10 below zero, practically tropical after 3 weeks of extreme cold. Families emerged from their cabins, gaunt and exhausted. Children had lost weight. Adults showed signs of cold exposure stress. The valley physician estimated that 15% of the population had suffered some degree of frostbite or cold-related illness. The Dalton children were healthy, well-fed, and energetic. Marcus Trent stood in Ezra's outer cabin, the abandoned, freezing shell that surrounded the warm bunker, and studied the construction with new eyes. He touched the stone-packed walls. He measured the thickness. He examined the sealed joints. Then he said the words that cost him professional pride, but earned him intellectual honesty. "I was wrong. This isn't a death trap. This is the only structure in the valley that actually beat winter." Samuel Pruitt came the next day. He brought his tools and his notebook. He asked Ezra to explain every detail: the stone selection, the clay mixture, the ventilation design, the stove placement, the thermal mass calculation. Ezra showed him everything. No secrets, no patents, no territorial pride. "Winter doesn't care about convention," Ezra said. "It cares about physics. I just listened to what the cold was trying to teach us." By New Year's Day, 1888, 7 families had asked Ezra for his plans. By the end of January, 3 cabins in the valley were undergoing modification. Marcus Trent himself began designing an inner chamber addition for a widow whose cabin had nearly killed her during the December siege. The numbers had done what no argument could. They'd made denial impossible. 22 degrees warmer, 60% less wood, 8-hour heat retention versus 2, comfortable floors versus frozen ground, healthy children versus sick ones. The bunker inside the cabin wasn't madness. It was the first honest answer to Montana winter that Bitterroot Valley had ever seen. Spring came to Bitterroot Valley in late March 1888, bringing with it something more significant than snowmelt: a quiet revolution in frontier architecture. Marcus Trent, The man who'd publicly called Ezra's design a death trap became its most influential convert. In April, he began construction on what he called a Dalton-style thermal core for the widow Emma Blackwell, whose December suffering had nearly ended in tragedy. Trent modified the design, using local materials and his own masonry expertise, but the principle remained: a stone-wrapped inner chamber with thermal mass walls and reduced heating volume. By May, Samuel Pruitt had documented the construction method in a detailed manuscript he titled Practical Thermal Architecture for Extreme Climates. He sent copies to the Territorial Engineering Office, the Helena newspaper, and 3 homesteading associations across Montana and Wyoming. Captain Howell did something even more important. He admitted his error in writing. His report to the Territorial Safety Office included a full retraction of his disaster prediction and a technical analysis of why Ezra's design worked. He concluded, "The inner chamber method represents a significant advancement in cold climate shelter. It should be studied, not scorned." But the real validation came from the settlers themselves, the families who'd survived the Bitterroot Siege and had no interest in ideology, only survival. By summer's end, 5 cabins in the immediate valley had incorporated thermal core modifications. Each adapted the principle to their specific situation. The Morrison family built a stone-insulated room within their existing cabin, reducing their heated space from 300 square feet to 150. They used river rock and clay, following Ezra's material choices almost exactly. The Chun family, Chinese railroad workers who'd settled in the valley, created a hybrid design that incorporated elements of the Kong heated bed platform from their homeland. Their inner chamber included a thermal bench that absorbed stove heat and radiated it through the night. The Harrisons built an earth-sheltered addition to their cabin's north side, using sod, stone, and timber to create what was essentially a dugout bunker attached to their existing structure. The result: a warm sleeping room that required almost no direct heating. Each design was different. Each solved slightly different problems, but all shared the same core insight: reduce volume, increase thermal mass, prevent heat loss. By the winter of 1888 to 89, 14 structures in the Bitterroot Valley and surrounding regions had some form of inner chamber or thermal core design. That winter was milder than the previous one, but the results were still dramatic. Families reported wood savings of 30 to 50%. Interior temperatures stayed consistently above 60 degrees. Cold-related illnesses dropped significantly. The technique spread through letters, through travelers, through the kind of word of mouth that only survival wisdom earns. A homesteader in Wyoming read about it in a Helena newspaper article. A family in northern Idaho heard about it from a visiting relative. A missionary in the Flathead Valley sketched the design after seeing it during a supply run. By 1890, variations of the thermal core cabin were documented across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Some were sophisticated stone constructions. Others were simple double-wall designs with earth fill. Some incorporated root, cellars, and food storage into the thermal mass. Others combined the heating chamber with kitchen functions, creating warm, multi-use cores. The innovation entered the cultural memory of the region, not as Ezra Dalton's bunker, but simply as building smart for cold. It became one of those quiet pieces of frontier knowledge that settlers shared as readily as they shared seed varieties or water-finding techniques. What started as mockery became standard practice. The phrase that captured the transformation came from Marcus Trent himself, spoken during a community meeting in the fall of 1889. "We thought Ezra was being stubborn. Turned out he was being practical." There's a difference between tradition and wisdom. Tradition is doing what we've always done. Wisdom is doing what actually works. Ezra never sought credit or fame. He shared his methods freely, helped neighbors with calculations, and quietly went back to running his sawmill. But his legacy was written in warm homes, healthy children, and wood piles that lasted through winter instead of running out in January. The inner chamber taught the valley something deeper than construction technique. It taught them that survival wisdom often looks crazy until crisis proves it essential. That innovation can come from desperation as easily as from genius. That the difference between madness and brilliance is sometimes just a thermometer and the courage to trust numbers over consensus. The ancient peoples knew this. The Mandan built earth lodges that held heat through plains winters that killed European settlers. The Sami built turf homes in Arctic conditions. The Inuit created snow houses that trapped body heat in negative 50-degree storms. Scandinavian settlers brought stone mass heaters that burned small fires and radiated warmth for days. Ezra Dalton didn't invent thermal mass or insulation barriers. He just remembered what industrial civilization was beginning to forget, that the best solutions to extreme environments are rarely the biggest, loudest, or most fuel-hungry. They're the smartest. Winter doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about pride, convention, or what the experts say should work. It only respects physics. And in 1887, in a valley where everyone built the same way, because that's how it had always been done, one man listened to physics instead of people. His family stayed warm. His neighbors stayed alive. And the definition of proper cabin changed forever. So here's my question for you. Which part of Ezra's solution would you apply to your home today? The thermal mass? The reduced heating volume? The insulation barrier? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. I want to know how cold it gets where you live and what you're doing to beat it. And if this story taught you something you didn't know, hit that like button and subscribe. Every week, we bring you real techniques that worked when life actually depended on it. No theory, no guessing, just frontier wisdom that proved itself in the hardest conditions humans have ever faced. Thanks for watching. Stay warm. And remember, the old ways aren't obsolete. They're just waiting for someone smart enough to listen. Note, this script is for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It depicts plausible frontier engineering based on documented thermal principles and vernacular architecture. While the characters and specific events are fictionalized, the technical concepts, thermal mass, reduced volume heating, insulation barriers, are rooted in real physics and historical building practices from various cold climate cultures.